To make the fabric accent piece that we print out and applique onto our embroidery, the first thing you will need to do is we'll need to take some fabric and freezer paper and adhere them together. 8.5 by 11 sheets of freezer paper work great. The roll that you buy in the grocery store is great for applique, but as far as printing through your printer, I would suggest getting the flat 8.5 by 11 sheets. So we're going to take a piece of fabric. I'm just using a muslin, and I'm going to put the right side down, although there probably isn't really a right and a wrong side on this. And I'm going to take the shiny side, the waxy side of the paper, and put it on the fabric. Now I'm going to use a dry hot iron to adhere the two together. And this is a very important step, because to run it through your printer without it jamming up, you're going to need those two stuck together really, really well. So take your time and just make sure that every edge and every little bit has that wax melted onto the fabric. Now after we finish ironing it, I'm going to take it to my cutting surface and I'm going to trim it. So I'm going to trim off the excess fabric, and it's better to err on the paper side and just take off a smidge of the paper rather than leave any of the fabric hanging out. And then once that's trimmed to the 8.5 by 11, if you need to, go ahead and press it again just to make sure all the sides are down. Great. All right, now we'll go to the printer. Now we have our piece of fabric and freezer paper adhered together really, really well. And I've trimmed it down to 8.5 by 11. I've taken it to my printer. I'm going to load it in the paper tray, and my printer prints on the side that's down. So you'll need to know which way to put your paper and fabric in, whether it's right side up or right side down, or upside down. So you're just going to put it in the tray, and then we'll move on to the next step. Now that we have our fabric ready for the to print the applique piece on, we're going to go back to our pattern. I'm going to click on the link, and it opens up here, and there's 3 pages because it also has the embroidery pages. If I keep scrolling down there, we only want to print this first page. And I want to point out too, I made this nice thick black line around it so that when you're cutting it out, you have a little bit of a leeway. You don't have to be too careful about getting it right on the black line. Okay, so we're going to print this. So I'm going to go up to File and Print. Now there's 3 pages here, and we don't want to print all 3 pages. We just want to print this first page. So instead of saying print all, I'm going to print page 1. Now I want it to be really good quality, so I'm going to move that over too. So now that we have our fabric and freezer paper piece ready to go and in our printer, then we can hit print. Now we have the piece of fabric with the design printed on it. And what I've done is I've pulled the freezer paper off of the back, and we're going to use it again because the freezer paper can be used any number of times. So I've chosen the pattern that's in reverse. And that's the one you're going to need if you're going to use this method to trace your design. So I'm going to put it on the scan bed of my printer. And then I'm going to put the freezer paper back in my paper tray. And again, I want to make sure I put it in going the right way. I want it to print on the paper side, not the waxy side. So I'm going to put the paper side down, load it in there. Now what I'm going to do is, all I have to do is make a copy. I'm making 1 copy. And then the design will be printed on the freezer paper. And this is how I trace most of my designs. Occasionally I'll print right on the fabric, but most of the time I do it this way. Okay, so now we have the design in reverse on the paper side of a piece of freezer paper. Now on to the next step. So I've cut a piece of fabric that's a little bit bigger than the 8.5 by 11 sheet that I printed on the freezer paper. And I'm going to put it right side down on my pressing surface. And I'm going to put my pattern down. This is the pattern that I've just printed out on freezer paper. And again, with a dry hot iron, I'm going to press the two together. What this does is it stabilizes the fabric. So it makes it really, really easy to draw on and trace your design. And if you get your pattern and your fabric can't wiggle around and get off kilter. So it does two things, which is really nifty. And even if you don't want to print your design on the freezer paper, you just want to trace it, it's still a good idea to iron a piece of freezer paper on the back of your fabric, and you'd be able to see through to see the design to trace, because it stabilizes the fabric and makes it a lot easier to trace. Okay, so again, we want it down really, really well. And then we'll let that cool just a minute, and then we'll go to the light box and trace it out. Now we have our design printed on the freezer paper, ironed to the fabric. We go to my light box, and there's the design. Really easy to see, and it won't move from the fabric, and the fabric is nice and stabilized. It makes tracing easier. I like to use a Pilot friction pen, and it disappears with the heat of an iron, although it doesn't really disappear. And I wouldn't recommend using it on dark fabric, because when you iron it, then it leaves kind of a white line. But it makes it super easy to trace when you have that freezer paper on the background. How's that? Just like that. So that's how I trace most of my patterns. And if I have a large pattern that goes together, I just make the 4 sheets through the printer, if it takes 4 sheets to make the design. And then I might trim some of it and put them together and iron it all into one big piece. But that's really handy, because then when I'm really needed to move it over this light box surface, I don't have to worry about it moving around. It stays in place. And as you can see now, the numbers are going the right direction. That's why I needed it in reverse to begin with. Now on this one, since I am going to put the applique fabric, I don't really want to do an embroidery stitch underneath there. I'm just going to have my stitches end right there. So I want to make sure I get right up to the edge of where that tape measure will go, so that when it comes time to put that tape measure on there, it'll just fit right in there nicely. And you know, another thing I wanted to mention too, just real quick, it isn't necessary to draw each little loop like on these little lazy daisy stitches. You could draw each loop like this, but another thing you could do is just put a dot and a dot, 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 a dot on this side too. So that's much easier. Don't feel you always have to draw exactly what I draw. You could even just do this line and this line, and then just look back at the pattern to see this is a little buttonhole stitch. You don't have to trace each little line on there. So hopefully that'll help with any thing you don't like about tracing. There you go. So I've cut off this little piece, and I still have the remainder of this muslin that I can use at a later time if I need to. And what I've done is I've cut a piece of fusible web, a lightweight one, and I'm going to put it on the back of my fabric. And you want to use the manufacturer's directions for ironing it on. So we'll just give it a nice press. And then all I have to do is cut this out. And you can choose to just cut right along the yellow if you want. I wanted to leave a little bit of a black line, so I'm going to go a little closer. But having that nice thick line gives you a little bit of a cushion there. So if you do snip it a little too close, you can even it out. Voila! So I've traced it out, and now I've stitched it up. This one I just used 1 strand of 12 weight silky thread. And I've got my cut out tape measure. So all I have to do is peel the paper backing off of the fusible web, and I'm going to arrange it on my piece so that it fits there nicely. Just so. There, that looks pretty good. And then I'm going to give it a pressing again, following the manufacturer's directions as far as your time and if there's steam or no steam. And there it is. How about that? Isn't that kind of fun?